If the phrase polar vortex displacement has you checking your emergency kit and questioning everything you thought you understood about how a modern power grid actually fails, if you remember February of 2021 and you want to understand not just what happened then, but what is about to happen now and why the fixes people were promised have not materialized at the scale the engineering required, then hit like and subscribe to Signal Watch so you do not miss a single update as this event unfolds. Drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? How far are you from the south? And do you know whether your home's critical systems, heat, water pipes, backup power, are actually rated for sustained temperatures below 20 degrees Fahrenheit? Because that question will matter more in the next 72 hours than almost anything else we could ask. If you want to help this community keep doing this work, share this video on X, Facebook, Reddit, or in your group chats. You are the reason we can keep chasing stories like this. So thank you. Now, here's what this investigation is going to cover. The specific atmospheric mechanism, a sudden stratospheric warming event that broke the polar vortex in 2021 and is producing the current displacement, and why the science says these events are becoming more frequent, not less. The engineering reality of what unweatherized actually means for a natural gas wellhead at 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and why the fuel supply failure, not the wind turbine freeze, was the primary driver of the 2021 collapse. What ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, actually did and did not do with the winterization mandate it was given after 2021, and where the gaps in that mandate are visible right now. And the cascading failure architecture, the sequence of events that converts a weather emergency into a humanitarian one, that the February 2021 event traced in devastating detail and that the current setup threatens to retrace. Now, settle in and let's get into it. On February 10th, 2021, the temperature in Houston, Texas, fell below 20 degrees Fahrenheit for the first time since 1989. By February 11th, it had reached 8 degrees Fahrenheit, a record for the date and, in the experience of most Houston residents, a temperature that belonged to a different country, a different latitude, a different world entirely. Houston is not prepared for 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The city's water pipes are not insulated for 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Its natural gas distribution infrastructure is not heat traced for 8 degrees Fahrenheit. The wellheads, compressor stations, and processing facilities supplying the natural gas that fuels the power plants that supply the electric grid are not winterized for 8 degrees Fahrenheit. And the power plants themselves, some of them, including several of the state's largest thermal generators, are not equipped with the instrument heat tracing, bearing warmers, and pipe insulation that power plants in cold climate regions uses standard equipment to remain operational through sustained deep freezes. At peak on February 15th and 16th of 2021, approximately 34,000 megawatts of electricity generating capacity tripped offline across the Texas grid, managed by ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, which operates an electrical grid that is famously and deliberately isolated from the rest of the continental United States to avoid federal regulation. 34,000 megawatts offline in a state whose total winter peak demand at the height of the freeze was approximately 69,000 megawatts. Nearly half the grid's generating capacity gone simultaneously in a system with no meaningful connection to neighboring grids that could have provided emergency power imports. Approximately 4.5 million Texas households lost power, not for hours, for days, in temperatures that remained below freezing continuously for more than a week in much of the state. 246 people died as a direct result of the freeze, a figure that subsequent analyses by academic researchers using excess mortality methods placed considerably higher. A study published in the journal Nature Medicine by researchers at Baylor College of Medicine estimated the actual death toll at approximately 700 people. The Texas Department of State Health Services' own retrospective analysis, published in 2022, estimated that approximately 246 deaths were directly attributable, with the total likely substantially higher when indirect effects, hypothermia in vehicles, carbon monoxide poisoning from improvised heating, medical emergencies worsened by healthcare facility power loss, were included. The economic damage from the February 2021 event was estimated by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas at approximately $80 to $130 billion, making it the costliest weather disaster in Texas history, exceeding even Hurricane Harvey of 2017, which had been the previous benchmark. That is the calibration point. That is what happened 4 years ago. And that is the event whose lessons the current polar vortex displacement is about to test. In a system that has made genuine but incomplete changes since 2021, against a meteorological forcing that the models are depicting as comparable in severity to the event that produced the largest grid failure in the history of the continental United States. The question this investigation is built around is not whether the current event will cause problems. It will. The question is whether what Texas and the southern United States have done in the 4 years since 2021 is enough to prevent those problems from becoming a repetition of the catastrophe, or whether the gap between what was promised, what was required, and what was actually built is large enough that the current polar vortex displacement finds the same vulnerabilities that the 2021 event exposed. The answer requires understanding three things precisely: the atmospheric mechanism producing the current freeze, the engineering reality of what was and was not winterized since 2021, and the grid operations architecture that will determine how close ERCOT comes to controlled or uncontrolled load shedding in the next 96 hours. The polar vortex is not a storm. It is a large-scale atmospheric circulation feature, a persistent, semi-permanent region of low pressure and cold air that sits over the Arctic in the middle and upper stratosphere, roughly 10 to 50 kilometers above the surface, during the winter months. It is maintained by the temperature contrast between the frigid Arctic and the warmer mid-latitudes, and it is kept in place, roughly centered over the North Pole, by the strength of the stratospheric jet stream circling its outer boundary. When the polar vortex is strong and coherent, it acts as a containment vessel. The coldest Arctic air stays inside it, over the Arctic, where it belongs in a meteorological sense. The jet stream at the tropopause, the boundary between the troposphere, where weather occurs, and the stratosphere above it, is correspondingly strong and zonal, meaning it flows roughly east to west around the globe in a relatively tight circular pattern. Under these conditions, North America's winter is cold in the north and mild in the south, and the boundary between them is reasonably well defined and reasonably stable. What is happening right now, what happened in February of 2021 and is happening again in the current setup, is called a sudden stratospheric warming event, or SSW. The mechanism is well understood in the atmospheric science literature, studied extensively through the satellite era of stratospheric observation, and increasingly studied in the context of its surface weather impacts. When planetary scale waves in the troposphere, large meanders in the atmospheric flow driven by the contrast between land and ocean temperatures, by major mountain ranges like the Rockies, and by tropical heating patterns, propagate upward into the stratosphere with sufficient amplitude, they deposit energy that warms the stratospheric polar region. When this warming is sufficiently rapid and intense, when the polar stratosphere warms by 30, 40, or even 60 degrees Celsius in a period of days, the temperature gradient that maintains the polar vortex is disrupted. The vortex weakens, elongates, and in the most extreme events, splits into two separate vortex lobes that migrate off the polar axis and descend toward mid-latitudes. This is the polar vortex disruption. The stratospheric event typically precedes its surface weather consequences by 2 to 4 weeks. The time it takes for the stratospheric signal to propagate downward into the troposphere and alter the jet stream's behavior at the level where weather actually occurs. When the signal does arrive at the surface, it manifests as an amplified jet stream pattern, a dramatically wavy high-amplitude flow with a persistent ridge of high pressure in one location and a persistent trough of cold air in another. The cold air that was contained inside the polar vortex is no longer contained. It is free to migrate equatorward with the trough, pushed southward by the ridge's circulation, sometimes reaching latitudes far south of anything the affected region's infrastructure was designed to accommodate. Dr. Judah Cohen, Director of Seasonal Forecasting at Atmospheric and Environmental Research, AER, and one of the most published researchers on polar vortex dynamics and their surface weather consequences, has spent 2 decades studying the relationship between sudden stratospheric warming events and extreme cold outbreaks in the mid-latitudes. His research, published in journals including Nature Climate Change, Geophysical Research Letters, and the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, has documented a statistically significant increase in the frequency and intensity of SSW events over the observational record of the past 30 years, and has established the mechanistic pathway through which SSW events produce the specific weather pattern responsible for the February 2021 Texas freeze. In a paper published in Science Advances in 2022, Dr. Cohen and colleagues analyzed the February 2021 polar vortex disruption in detail and found that the event was in the 99th percentile of SSW severity in the modern record, one of the strongest sudden stratospheric warmings ever measured. The polar vortex did not just weaken, it split into two daughter vortices, one of which descended over North America and drove the Arctic air mass southward with exceptional depth and persistence. The current polar vortex disruption, detected in stratospheric temperature data from the NOAA 20 satellite series and confirmed in the MERA-2 reanalysis data maintained by NASA's Global Modeling and Assimilation Office, shows a sudden stratospheric warming event that began approximately 2.5 weeks before the current forecast event, consistent with the 2 to 4 week stratospheric to surface lag time that Dr. Cohen's research identifies. The stratospheric polar temperature anomaly at the 10 hectopascal level, approximately 31 kilometers altitude, peaked at approximately 44 degrees Celsius above the climatological mean for the date, placing it in the 95th percentile of SSW events in the MERA-2 record extending to 1980. The downstream forecast, the tropospheric pattern emerging from this SSW, depicted consistently across the ECMWF, GFS, and Canadian model ensembles, shows the Arctic air mass, organized as a coherent lobe of the split vortex, positioned directly over the southern United States for a period of 5 to 7 days. 5 to 7 days of sustained Arctic air over a region whose infrastructure was designed for temperatures that reach but rarely sustain below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The same pattern, the same duration, the same geographic targeting as 2021. The question is whether the infrastructure beneath it is the same. The narrative that emerged from the February 2021 event in most public coverage, and that persists in popular understanding of what caused the blackout, focused heavily on frozen wind turbines. Images of ice-covered wind turbine blades, circulated widely on social media and amplified by politically motivated commentary, became the dominant public explanation for why the Texas grid failed. The framing was factually incomplete to the point of being misleading, and understanding why requires looking at the numbers the Electric Reliability Council of Texas itself reported. At the peak of the February 2021 outage, ERCOT's own operational data, documented in the agency's formal post-event report and subsequently analyzed in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and North American Electric Reliability Corporation's joint investigation published in November 2021, showed that approximately 17,000 megawatts of the total 34,000 megawatts of lost generation capacity came from natural gas facilities that tripped offline due to weather-related failures. Approximately 1,000 megawatts came from wind generation. Approximately 1,000 megawatts came from nuclear generation. The remainder came from coal and other thermal sources. Natural gas, 17,000 megawatts. Wind, 1,000 megawatts. The narrative assigned the cause to wind. The numbers assigned it to natural gas. The specific failure mechanisms in the natural gas generation and supply system were documented in detail in the FERC-NERC joint investigation. Wellheads froze. Produced water, the water that co-emerges with natural gas from the production well, froze in separators and pipes at the wellhead, blocking gas flow. Instrument air systems. The compressed air systems that operate pneumatic valves and controls throughout the natural gas production and processing infrastructure froze when moisture in the instrument air lines condensed and froze at low temperatures, causing control valves to fail in closed positions and shutting down production automatically. Compressor stations, the facilities that pressurize natural gas for pipeline transport, experienced bearing failures, lube oil system failures, and fuel gas supply failures when their own fuel gas supply froze. Processing plants, the facilities that remove impurities and liquids from raw natural gas before it enters the pipeline transmission system, tripped offline due to similar freezing failures in instrumentation and heat-sensitive process equipment. The FERC-NERC investigation identified approximately 460 individual points of failure in the natural gas supply system during the 2021 event. 460 separate freeze-related equipment failures, each of which reduced the flow of natural gas available to the power plants that needed it to generate electricity. Power plants without fuel cannot generate power. This is not complicated, and it is what happened. The engineering term for the systems that prevent this is winterization, a package of measures that includes heat tracing on exposed piping and instrumentation, insulation of vulnerable equipment, enclosures around sensitive control systems, winterized lubricants for rotating equipment, and in the most critical applications, backup heating systems that operate independently of the grid power supply. Winterization is standard practice in the natural gas production and power generation industries operating in cold climate regions. The gas wells of North Dakota, the compressor stations of Wyoming, the power plants of Minnesota, they operate through sustained temperatures of 30, 40, 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit because they were built with the equipment required to do so. Texas's gas infrastructure was not because the technology doesn't exist, not because the industry didn't know that cold temperatures could cause these failures. The Texas energy industry had experienced freeze-related outages in 2011, in 1989, and in 1983. After each event, investigations identified winterization failures. After each event, recommendations were made. After each event, in the absence of mandatory requirements with enforceable standards and meaningful penalties, the recommendations were largely not implemented. Dr. Joshua Rhodes, a researcher at the University of Texas at Austin's Energy Institute, whose work focuses on the economics and reliability of the Texas electricity market, analyzed the winterization decision economics in a paper published in Nature Energy in 2022. His analysis documented that the expected cost of winterizing a natural gas power plant in Texas, adding heat tracing, insulation, and cold weather operational procedures, is approximately $50,000 to $300,000 per unit, depending on plant size and current condition. The expected benefit, calculated as the probability of a weather event requiring winterization multiplied by the avoided economic damages of a grid failure, is, in the Texas electricity market's historical pricing structure, insufficient to produce a positive return on investment for an individual plant owner operating in the competitive market without a winterization mandate. Individual rational actors in a competitive electricity market will not winterize voluntarily if the economics don't support it. This is not a moral failure. It is a market structure problem. The market structure problem was not addressed in 2021. The question for the current event is how much of the gap has been closed by the mandatory requirements that were imposed, and how much remains open. In June of 2021, the Texas legislature passed Senate Bill 3, the primary legislative response to the February 2021 grid failure. The bill required ERCOT and the Public Utility Commission of Texas to establish mandatory weatherization standards for generating units and critical natural gas infrastructure. It created inspection requirements, it established penalties for noncompliance, and it was, at the time of its passage, described by state officials as a comprehensive response to the vulnerabilities exposed by the freeze. The implementation of Senate Bill 3, what it actually required, what inspections actually found, and what compliance actually looks like in the field, is a more complicated picture than the passage of the legislation suggested. The Public Utility Commission of Texas and the Railroad Commission of Texas, which regulates natural gas production, developed their weatherization standards through a rulemaking process completed in late 2021 and early 2022. The standards established minimum temperature thresholds below which generating units and natural gas facilities must be able to operate, effectively, the cold weather design point for weatherization requirements. The temperature threshold selected for most of the state was based on a historical extreme weather event analysis, specifically the historical lowest temperatures recorded at each facility's location, adjusted by a safety margin. The critical question, identified by engineers and policy researchers including Dr. Rhodes and colleagues at the University of Texas Energy Institute in subsequent analysis, is whether the historical extreme event basis for the threshold adequately reflects the weather events that the 21st century polar vortex disruption pattern is capable of producing in Texas. Historical records at many Texas locations do not include temperatures as extreme as those recorded in February of 2021, because February of 2021 produced temperatures that were themselves historic. If the weatherization standard is calibrated to a historical record that excludes the event it was designed to prevent the recurrence of, the standard is underspecified by construction. The Railroad Commission's inspection program for natural gas wellheads and facilities, required under Senate Bill 3, reported in its 2023 annual compliance summary that approximately 78% of critical natural gas facilities required to weatherize had submitted weatherization plans and certification of compliance. 22% of facilities had either not submitted plans or had submitted plans with identified deficiencies. The Commission acknowledged in the same report that field verification of the submitted certifications, the physical inspection of whether the reported weatherization was actually in place, had been completed for approximately 41% of facilities by the end of 2023. 41% field verified, 22% not in compliance with the submission requirement by the end of 2023, more than 2 years after the legislation's passage. The Public Utility Commission's weatherization inspection data for electric generating units, published in its 2024 annual report, showed that ERCOT-registered generating units with capacity above 10 megawatts had been inspected, and that compliance with minimum weatherization standards was reported at approximately 89% of inspected facilities. 11% inspected facilities had findings requiring corrective action, with a portion of those findings characterized as high severity, meaning the identified deficiency was directly relevant to cold weather generating capacity. 11% of inspected generating capacity with high severity cold weather deficiencies in the winter before an event of this character. Dr. Michael Weber, professor of energy resources at the University of Texas at Austin and deputy director of the university's Energy Institute, testified before the Texas legislature in February of 2023, 2 years after the 2021 freeze, that the weatherization progress achieved by that point represented meaningful but incomplete reduction in cold weather risk to the grid. His testimony, available in the public record of the Texas Senate Committee on Business and Commerce, specifically noted that the natural gas supply chain, the wellheads, compressor stations, and processing facilities presented a persistently incomplete compliance picture that remained the primary vulnerability in the system. He noted that a sufficiently extreme cold event, one reaching or exceeding the depths of February 2021, remained capable of producing substantial natural gas supply failures despite the progress made. Meaningful but incomplete, persistently incomplete compliance. 2 years after the event that killed approximately 700 Texans. The current polar vortex displacement is forecast to bring temperatures into the Texas Panhandle and Hill Country that approach or in some locations exceed the February 2021 lows. The compliance picture documented in 2023 and 2024 is the engineering reality sitting beneath those temperatures. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, is the most unusual major power grid in the continental United States, and its specific structural characteristics are essential context for understanding how a polar vortex event translates into a grid crisis in Texas in ways that would play out differently on any other major American grid. ERCOT operates what is called an energy-only market, a wholesale electricity market in which generators are paid for the energy they produce, but receive no capacity payment. No payment for simply being available to generate when needed. Most other major U.S. electricity markets operate energy plus capacity markets, in which generators receive revenue for maintaining available capacity, incentivizing investment in reliability even during periods when the generator is not dispatched, because market prices don't make generation economically attractive. The capacity payment structure, in those markets, provides a financial incentive to invest in winterization. Because a generator that cannot operate during a cold weather event loses both its energy revenue and its capacity revenue. In ERCOT's energy-only market, a generator that cannot operate during a cold weather event loses only its energy revenue. Revenue that, during a deep freeze, is at its most extreme because electricity scarcity prices drive the wholesale market to its administrative cap. The ERCOT market's price cap, the maximum price that can be cleared in the wholesale energy market, was set in 2021 at $9,000 per megawatt hour. During the February 2021 event, the market price was at or near that cap continuously for several days. A generator that was online and generating during that period earned extraordinary revenue. A generator that had tripped offline because of a frozen instrument line or a failed compressor bearing earned nothing. The perverse economic dynamic of the energy-only market during extreme events is well understood in the electricity economics literature. Dr. Cara Marston, an energy economist at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, published an analysis in the journal Electricity Journal in 2022, documenting that ERCOT's energy-only market creates what she called a reliability paradox. Generators that invest in winterization incur certain upfront costs while reducing their probability of earning the highest possible market prices, which occur precisely during the scarcity events that winterization is designed to prevent. From the perspective of an individual generator's financial model, the investment in winterization reduces expected revenues from scarcity events while adding certain costs, making it economically irrational without a mandatory requirement. This is the structural economic reason why the Texas grid was unweatherized in 2021. And it is why the mandatory requirement in Senate Bill 3, rather than the market, had to be the mechanism for change. ERCOT's real-time grid operations during a stress event function through a defined hierarchy of tools. The first tool is the voluntary conservation appeal. ERCOT asks Texans to reduce consumption. The second is emergency interruptible load service. Large industrial consumers who have contracted with ERCOT to reduce consumption on demand in exchange for reduced electricity rates are called to curtail. The third is controlled load shedding, rotating outages imposed on distribution feeders by the transmission and distribution utilities, typically in blocks of 15 to 45 minutes, cycling through the feeder population to distribute the burden. The difference between February 2021 and a managed load shedding event is that in 2021, ERCOT's controlled load shedding almost immediately became uncontrolled. The scale of generation loss, 34,000 megawatts, approaching half of total system capacity, exceeded the grid's ability to manage through rotating outages. Some distribution feeders that were supposed to be rotated back on after 45 minutes remained off for days because the total generation available was insufficient to serve even the cycling schedule. Customers who were supposed to receive power on rotation received nothing because there was no power to give them. The technical threshold that separates a controlled load shedding event from an uncontrolled cascading blackout is the relationship between total generation available and minimum system load, the lowest level of demand that a population of electricity consumers will draw even under emergency conditions. In a severe winter storm, minimum system load is high because heating demand cannot be reduced to zero. At the nadir of the 2021 event, ERCOT's available generation was insufficient to serve even its minimum load. The system was in what grid operators call load frequency collapse territory, the condition in which the frequency of the AC grid falls below the threshold at which generating units automatically trip offline to protect their equipment, creating a feedback loop of further generation loss that, if not arrested, terminates in a complete system blackout. ERCOT's operators manually ordered load shedding on a scale that held the frequency above the automatic trip threshold, barely. The system's operating frequency dropped to 59.4 Hz before load shedding arrested the decline. Normal operating frequency is 60 Hz. The designed automatic trip threshold for most large generators is 59.3 Hz. ERCOT came within 1/10 of 1 Hz, a margin of approximately 90 seconds, by the estimates of ERCOT's own post-event testimony to the Texas legislature, of a complete, uncontrolled system collapse that would have taken weeks rather than days to restore. 90 seconds, 1/10 of 1 Hz, between what happened and a collapse that ERCOT's own officials described as potentially lasting months. Dr. Thomas Overby, professor of electrical and computer engineering at Texas A&M University and a leading researcher in power systems analysis, has testified and published extensively on the February 2021 near miss. His analysis, presented at the IEE Power and Energy Society's general meeting in 2022, demonstrated through power flow simulation that a complete ERCOT system collapse, had the frequency drop through the 59.3 Hz trip threshold, would have created a restoration problem of extraordinary complexity. Large thermal generators, once tripped, cannot simply be restarted on demand. They require auxiliary power from the grid, the so-called black start capability, to initiate their restart sequence. In a complete system blackout, the black start resources, small peaking units and hydroelectric plants capable of restarting without external power, must be used to energize transmission lines sequentially, island by island, until enough generation is online to begin reconnecting load. For the Texas grid, with its specific mix of generation types and its isolation from neighboring systems, the estimated restoration time from a complete blackout was assessed in Dr. Overby's analysis at 3 to 6 weeks, 3 to 6 weeks without power in February in Texas. That is what 90 seconds prevented. And this is where the story takes a turn that most coverage of cold weather grid events misses entirely, because the power outage is not the end of the cascade. It is the beginning of it, and the second, third, and fourth order consequences of a sustained power outage in a deep freeze. The consequences that are not about electricity, but about water, heat, medicine, and communication, are where the humanitarian catastrophe actually lives. The first cascade from power loss in freezing temperatures is the water system failure. Municipal water systems depend on electric pumps to maintain pressure throughout the distribution network. When power is lost, the pumps stop, water pressure drops. In a sustained power outage, one lasting more than a few hours, pressure in the distribution system falls below the minimum required to maintain water at the tap in multi-story buildings. And in temperatures below freezing, the pipes themselves begin to freeze, not just in the street, but in attics, in interior wall cavities, in the crawl spaces of houses whose insulation was designed to keep heat in, not to keep cold out. In Texas in February 2021, water main breaks and pipe failures became a second parallel crisis that ran alongside the power crisis and in some ways outlasted it. The city of Houston's water system experienced approximately 12,000 water main breaks and service line failures during and after the freeze. The city of Austin declared a water emergency and asked residents to boil water for weeks after the freeze ended, because the water treatment plant had lost power and water quality could not be certified. Approximately 14 million Texans, nearly half the state's population, experienced water service disruptions of some kind during or in the weeks immediately following the freeze. 14 million people without reliable water in a state where the power was also out, in temperatures below freezing, meant that basic sanitation, toilet flushing, hand washing, food preparation, became impossible for an extended period for millions of households. The second cascade is the medical system. Hospitals depend on backup generator power to maintain operations during outages, and most hospitals maintain power during the 2021 event through diesel generator systems. But the healthcare cascade did not occur at the hospital level. It occurred at the home level, where people who depend on electrically powered home medical equipment, oxygen concentrators, home dialysis machines, insulin refrigeration, powered wheelchairs, home ventilators, found themselves without the power that their equipment requires. The Texas Department of State Health Services analysis of 2021 mortality documented that a significant number of the event's deaths occurred in this category. People whose medical conditions depended on electrical equipment, cut off from power for extended periods in freezing homes. The third cascade is the communication failure. In February 2021, wireless carrier cell towers in Texas began to lose power as their backup battery systems, typically sized for 4 to 8 hours of operation, depleted. Tower backup battery duration is a telecommunications industry standard designed for short outages, not multi-day events. As towers went offline in sequence, the wireless communication network in affected areas fragmented. People could not call for help. They could not access emergency information. They could not report medical emergencies or request welfare checks. The fourth cascade is the thermal cascade within the home, the progressive loss of residual building heat as the outdoor temperature stays below freezing and the interior temperature slowly drops toward the outdoor ambient. In a well-insulated, well-sealed modern house, residual heat from furnishings, occupants, and solar gain through windows can maintain interior temperatures above the danger zone, roughly 50 degrees Fahrenheit, for a day or more after heating loss. In a poorly insulated older house, which describes the median vintage of the Texas housing stock, which was built primarily in the post-war era and does not include the air sealing and insulation standards of modern energy codes, interior temperatures can track toward outdoor ambient within hours. Dr. Ganesh Vaidya, a public health researcher at the University of Texas Health Science Center at Houston, published a study in the American Journal of Public Health in 2023 tracing the specific mortality pathway of cold exposure deaths during the 2021 event. His analysis found that the median victim of cold exposure death during the event was an elderly person living alone in a single-family home of pre-1980 construction, without a backup heating source, who experienced a power outage exceeding 36 hours. The combination of older housing stock, social isolation, and extended outage duration was the specific compound that converted a grid failure into a death. That compound, older housing, social isolation, extended outage, is not specific to 2021. It is the enduring demographic and built environment reality of Texas and the broader southern United States. The single most consequential vulnerability in the Texas power system, documented in the 2021 post-event analysis, acknowledged in the Senate Bill 3 rulemaking, and the subject of the most contested compliance picture in the subsequent inspection data, is the natural gas supply chain. Understanding why this specific piece of infrastructure is the limiting factor in the current event requires understanding the interdependency between natural gas production and electric power that creates a uniquely dangerous feedback loop. Natural gas producing infrastructure in Texas, the wellheads, compressor stations, gathering lines, and processing facilities, requires electricity to operate. The instrument controls, the separator heaters, the compressor station facilities, the pump systems that move produced water, all of them depend on either grid power or on-site generation. When grid power is lost because natural gas supply has failed, the ability to restore natural gas supply is impaired because the grid power that natural gas infrastructure needs to operate is not available. The system is a loop. Each component depends on the other. When the loop breaks, it cannot be easily restarted from inside itself. This is what engineers call a event failure, or, in the grid reliability literature, an interdependent infrastructure failure. The February 2021 event was not primarily a power grid failure that caused natural gas supply problems. It was simultaneously and codependently a natural gas supply failure and a power grid failure, each of which was making the other worse in real time. Dr. Quentin Grafton, a professor of economics at Australian National University, who has studied energy system interdependencies globally, published an analysis of the Texas 2021 event in the journal Energy Policy, examining specifically this codependency. His analysis identified what he called the dual dependency trap. The structural vulnerability created when two critical infrastructure systems depend on each other for inputs, such that a failure in either system propagates to the other and creates a compound collapse that is harder to arrest than either system failure alone would be. The natural gas supply chain's weather vulnerabilities, documented at 460 separate failure points in 2021, are addressed in Senate Bill 3's regulatory requirements. But the enforcement architecture of Senate Bill 3 contains a specific limitation that energy policy researchers identified early in the implementation process and that has become directly relevant to the current event. The Railroad Commission of Texas, which regulates the natural gas production and gathering sector, established its weatherization requirements through its own rulemaking authority. But the Texas legislature, in the course of negotiating Senate Bill 3's passage, did not grant the Railroad Commission explicit authority to mandate weatherization of natural gas facilities that classify as natural gas production rather than transportation and distribution. This classification distinction between the production side and the transportation and distribution side of the gas supply chain left a regulatory gap at precisely the wellhead and gathering system level where the majority of the 2021 failures occurred. Dr. Emily Gruber, then Assistant Professor of Sustainable Energy Policy at Georgia Tech, testified before the Texas Senate in April of 2023 about this specific gap. Her testimony, recorded in the Senate Committee on Business and Commerce archives, noted that the regulatory gap meant that the wellheads and gathering systems responsible for the largest volume of production lost during the 2021 event were, in many cases, not subject to the mandatory weatherization requirements that Senate Bill 3 had established. They were encouraged to weatherize, they were asked to self-certify, they were subject to inspection when resources permitted, but they were not subject to enforceable mandatory requirements under the same framework that applied to electric generating units. Two different oversight frameworks, one event with one cause, and the cause sits in the less regulated half. The Railroad Commission's own compliance data, published in its 2023 annual report, showed that natural gas wellhead facilities in the Permian Basin and Eagle Ford shale plays, which together supply a majority of the gas used in Texas power generation, had weatherization self-certification rates of approximately 74%. 26% had not self-certified. And the field verification rate, the rate at which inspectors had physically confirmed that the reported weatherization was actually in place, was 41% of facilities overall and considerably lower in the most remote rural producing areas of the Permian Basin, where inspection logistics are most challenging. 26% non-certified, 41% field verified, against a polar vortex displacement targeting temperatures that approach or exceed the 2021 event. The current polar vortex displacement does not target Texas alone. Its geographic footprint, as depicted in the ECMWF ensemble and confirmed by the GFS and Canadian model guidance, covers a broad arc of the southern United States, from Texas eastward across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, and into the Carolinas. And the states east of Texas, while connected to the larger Eastern interconnection rather than ERCOT's isolated grid, face their own set of cold weather infrastructure vulnerabilities that the current event will expose. The Eastern interconnection, the large interconnected grid serving the eastern two-thirds of the continent, is in theory more resilient than ERCOT to regional cold weather events because it can import emergency power from neighboring areas. But the specific character of the current event, a broad, multi-state Arctic air mass covering most of the southern tier of the Eastern interconnection simultaneously, reduces that interconnection benefit substantially. When Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee are simultaneously experiencing demand surges from the cold weather, the power flows from cooler but generating neighbors in the Midwest and Southeast are constrained by what transmission capacity exists across the boundaries and how much surplus those neighboring systems have available. The Southeast Power Pool, the voluntary coordination mechanism for power system operations across the Southeast, not to be confused with the Southwest Power Pool, which is a full regional transmission organization, has protocols for emergency interutility energy sharing during extreme events. But these protocols have historically been tested against individual state emergencies, not against simultaneous grid stress across the entire southern tier. The Southern Company, the utility that serves Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and portions of Florida, operates a diverse generation mix that includes a significant nuclear fleet and natural gas peaking capacity. But the Southern Company's gas-fired generation faces the same natural gas supply chain vulnerabilities as Texas when temperatures drop into the single digits Fahrenheit across the Gulf Coast natural gas production and distribution system, which supplies both Texas's generation and the Southeast's gas-fired fleet. The same Gulf Coast natural gas production system, the same freeze-vulnerable infrastructure, the same codependency loop. Louisiana, whose grid is operated by Entergy Louisiana and connected to both the Eastern Interconnection and, through some tie lines, to the Texas grid, faces an additional specific vulnerability: a high concentration of large industrial electric load. Petrochemical facilities, refineries, and liquefied natural gas export terminals along the Gulf Coast that draws power intensively and represents a customer class whose power requirements cannot simply be interrupted without significant economic and industrial safety consequences. When Louisiana experiences a severe cold weather event, simultaneously with peak residential heating demand and reduced generation capacity, the utility is managing competing pressures from industrial and residential customers in a system that was not designed for the compound load profile. Dr. Siddharth Suresh, an energy systems researcher at Louisiana State University Center for Energy Studies, published a regional grid vulnerability assessment in the journal Energy Research and Social Science in 2023 that examined the cold weather reliability profile of the Gulf Coast state utilities, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas, under a range of extreme cold scenarios. His assessment found that under a scenario comparable to February 2021 in geographic extent and temperature depth, the scenario the current polar vortex displacement is producing, the combined Eastern Interconnection utilities of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas would experience demand generation imbalances requiring load shedding in the range of 3,000 to 7,000 megawatts, with the specific outcome depending critically on the degree to which Gulf Coast natural gas supply chains experienced freeze-related failure. 3,000 to 7,000 megawatts of load shedding across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Arkansas. In addition to whatever happens in Texas, simultaneously, from the same natural gas supply chain disruption. This is the compound picture east of Texas. The Eastern Interconnection provides resilience relative to ERCOT's isolation. It does not provide immunity from a southern tier event that stresses the entire region's gas supply simultaneously. The population at risk in a southern United States deep freeze event is distributed in a pattern of vulnerability that is importantly different from the distribution of population itself. And being precise about that distribution is essential for understanding where the human consequences will be most severe. The first dimension of vulnerability is housing stock age and quality. The southern United States has the largest inventory of housing built before 1970 in the continental United States outside of the Northeast. A housing stock whose insulation levels, air sealing, and pipe protection reflect the mild climate expectations of the region at the time of construction. A house built in Houston in 1955 has no pipe insulation in the attic. It has no exterior wall insulation beyond the minimum required for summer cooling efficiency. Its heating system, typically a natural gas furnace or a heat pump, is sized for heating to a set point of 70 degrees Fahrenheit against outdoor temperatures of 30 to 40 degrees, not against outdoor temperatures of 0 to 15 degrees. In a sustained deep freeze, it will lose heat faster than most of its occupants have ever experienced. The U.S. Census Bureau's American Housing Survey data for the South Census region, covering Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, and surrounding states, shows that approximately 42% of the occupied housing stock in the region was built before 1980. Of that pre-1980 stock, approximately 67% has never had significant weatherization upgrades, defined in the survey as insulation additions, air sealing, or window replacement, since original construction. These are the homes that will lose heat fastest. Many of them house the populations least able to leave. The second dimension is the concentrated geography of energy poverty in the southern United States. The South has the highest rate of energy poverty, defined as spending more than 6% of household income on energy costs, of any census region. The energy poverty rate in Louisiana is approximately 24% of households. In Mississippi, it is approximately 30%. In portions of Texas's Rio Grande Valley, it exceeds 35%. Energy-poor households are less likely to have backup heating sources, less likely to have emergency supplies, less likely to have transportation to reach warming centers, and more likely to live in the older housing stock described above. The third dimension is the specific vulnerability of the region's elderly and medically dependent population. The South has a high and growing proportion of elderly residents, a reflection of both the in-migration of retirees and the persistent out-migration of working-age adults from economically distressed rural communities. Approximately 17.3% of the South's population is over 65, compared to 16.8% nationally. The rural South, where access to emergency warming shelters is limited by distance and transportation, has a proportionally higher elderly share than the urban South, and as documented in Dr. Vaidy's analysis of the 2021 mortality pattern, the elderly living alone in older housing stock with extended power outages are the specific population most at risk of cold exposure death. The combination of these three dimensions, old housing, energy poverty, elderly isolation, creates concentrated geographic pockets of extreme vulnerability that are entirely predictable in their location. They are in the rural Rio Grande Valley of Texas. They are in the Mississippi Delta. They are in rural Louisiana parishes along the Gulf Coast. They are in the Appalachian communities of Tennessee and Alabama. These communities are not hard to find. They are in the census data, in the housing survey data, in the energy poverty maps maintained by the Department of Energy's Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, the LEHEAT program, which tracks the intersection of energy cost burden and household income at the county level nationwide. The warming centers and emergency shelters that serve as the primary community resource for people who lose power during a winter emergency are located primarily in cities and large towns, schools, community centers, convention facilities. For a rural resident of the Mississippi Delta without a car, in a power outage at 15 degrees Fahrenheit, the warming center in the nearest town might as well be in a different state. The National Weather Service operates a comprehensive weather warning system for extreme cold events through its network of weather forecast offices and its suite of warning products, wind chill advisories, wind chill warnings, and winter storm warnings, issued in the standard tiered format that the agency uses for all hazardous weather products. These products are delivered through the Emergency Alert System, through the NOAA All Hazards Radio Network, through the Wireless Emergency Alert System on mobile devices, and through the agency's integrated public-facing digital and social media communications. The weather warning system for cold events functions adequately at communicating that cold temperatures are coming. It is not designed to communicate the specific consequences of cold temperatures for specific categories of infrastructure, and the gap between the meteorological warning and the infrastructure impact warning is where lives are lost. On February 8, 2021, 3 days before the worst of the freeze, the NWS issued winter storm warnings covering much of Texas. The warnings accurately predicted the timing and approximate magnitude of the temperature drops that would follow. What they did not, and operating within their design parameters, could not communicate was the specific sequence of events that would follow temperature drop at the infrastructure level. That natural gas wellheads in the Permian Basin would begin freezing within hours of temperatures dropping below approximately 15 degrees Fahrenheit. That as wellhead production fell, gas pressure in the transmission system would drop. That as transmission pressure dropped, gas-fired power plants would begin tripping offline due to insufficient fuel pressure. That as power plants tripped offline, ERCOT would begin controlled load shedding. That controlled load shedding would rapidly become uncontrolled because the volume of offline generation was too large to manage through rotation, and that by the time load shedding became uncontrolled, the public communication infrastructure itself, cell towers, internet access points, the digital information environment, would begin to fail. By the time millions of Texans realized what was happening, the system for informing them about what was happening had partly broken down. The NOAA-funded research program in public warning communication, overseen by NOAA's social science program within the Weather Program Office, has studied the specific failure modes of weather-based emergency communication during events that produce cascading infrastructure failures. A study led by Dr. James Kimple of the University of Oklahoma's Cooperative Institute for Mesoscale Meteorological Studies, published in Weather, Climate, and Society in 2022, examined public understanding and behavioral response during the Texas February 2021 event. The study found that the most consequential communication gap was not the absence of weather warnings, those were issued, but the absence of actionable infrastructure impact warnings. Specific guidance on what vehicle sequence to expect, when to expect it, what preparations were still possible before the cascade became uncontrollable, and what alternatives existed when the primary power, water, and communication systems failed. The study found that the majority of survey respondents who experienced multi-day outages had not prepared adequately because they did not anticipate that the outage would last more than a few hours. The winter storm warning told them it would be very cold. It did not tell them that very cold for 3 days in an unweatherized grid could mean no power for 5 days, no water pressure for 2 weeks, and no cell service for 4 days. The warning gap is not a failure of meteorological science. It is a failure of the translation layer between what the atmosphere is going to do and what the infrastructure is going to do in response. FEMA's National Integration Center, working with the National Weather Service and state emergency management agencies, has been developing what it calls impact-based decision support services for emergency managers, IBW, or impact-based warnings, that attempt to bridge this gap by translating weather forecasts into specific infrastructure impact projections for emergency managers. The IBW system has been piloted in several NWS offices and has been identified in the agency's strategic planning documents as a priority capability development. Its implementation has been uneven, richer in some regions and some hazard types than others. For cold weather grid impacts specifically, the IBW system as implemented in Texas at the time of the current event includes coordination protocols between the NWS Weather Forecast Office in Fort Worth and ERCOT's Operations Center. Protocols that allow ERCOT to receive direct briefings from NWS forecasters, and that give NWS forecasters access to ERCOT's operational status in near real time. This coordination, which did not exist at the operational level in February 2021, represents a genuine improvement in the warning architecture. Whether it translates to better public communication about the specific infrastructure consequence cascade is the variable that the current event will test. 4 years after February 2021, the accounting of what has changed in the Texas power system and what has not requires the same honesty that the investigation has applied throughout. No inflation of the progress, no dismissal of it. What has genuinely changed? The electric generating units that are the most critical to ERCOT's winter reliability, the large thermal generators, the combined cycle gas plants, and the nuclear fleet have been inspected under the Senate Bill 3 framework, and the compliance rate among inspected units is approximately 89% meeting minimum weatherization standards. This represents a real and meaningful improvement from the essentially zero mandatory requirement that existed before 2021. The largest and most critical units, those above 250 megawatts of capacity, have been prioritized in the inspection program and show the highest compliance rates. ERCOT's market design has been modified to include what the agency calls an operating reserve demand curve, a mechanism that compensates generators for providing available capacity above the minimum required for energy delivery. This is not a full capacity market. It does not provide the same investment signal as the capacity payment structures used in PJM or MISO, but it provides a partial revenue stream for availability that was completely absent from the pre-2021 market design. Several analyses by electricity market researchers, including Dr. Joshua Rhodes at UT Austin, have estimated that the operating reserve demand curve has modestly improved the investment economics for reliability improvements, including weatherization. The NWS ERCOT Coordination Protocol has been established and practiced through tabletop exercises, improving the speed at which ERCOT operators receive critical meteorological information during developing events. The Texas Division of Emergency Management has expanded its warming center pre-positioning protocols and has pre-identified backup shelter locations with generator power and water supply for use in extended cold weather events. What has not changed or changed inadequately? The natural gas supply chain regulatory gap, identified in the Senate Bill 3 implementation review, remains. Wellheads and gathering systems responsible for the majority of the 2021 production failure are regulated under a framework with lower mandatory requirements, lower inspection completion rates, and lower field verification rates than the electric generating unit framework. In a cold weather event of comparable depth and duration to 2021, the same codependency loop is present, and the same supply chain is the weakest link in the system. ERCOT's grid isolation remains. Texas is still not meaningfully interconnected with neighboring grids in a way that would allow significant emergency power imports in a major supply shortage. The DC ties between Texas and neighboring states, specifically the 220 megawatt DC tie to the eastern interconnection at Lamar, Texas, and the additional limited interconnections at the Mexican border, provide a trivial fraction of the emergency assistance capacity that would be needed in a 2021 scale event. The political and economic barriers to expanding ERCOT's interconnection, which would bring Texas under federal jurisdiction through FERC, have not been overcome in the 4 years since 2021. The housing stock has not changed. The 4 million to 5 million Texas homes most vulnerable to rapid thermal loss during a power outage, older, poorly insulated, single-family structures, are still occupied by the same populations. The LEHEAP Weatherization Assistance Program, which funds insulation and ceiling upgrades for low-income households, has received increased funding in recent federal appropriations cycles, but the scale of the program relative to the weatherization need. Approximately 35,000 homes upgraded nationally per year against a backlog in Texas alone of hundreds of thousands of vulnerable homes
means the housing stock change will take decades at current program pace. The honest accounting is a balance sheet with genuine entries on both sides. The grid is better prepared than it was. It is not as well prepared as the magnitude of the 2021 event and the scale of the potential consequences demanded it become. In the operational time window of the current polar vortex event, the sequence of events that will determine whether this event remains a manageable emergency or approaches the character of a 2021 recurrence is predictable enough to describe with precision, because the 2021 event already traced it once, in real time, and the post-event analysis documented each decision point and threshold. The first critical variable is natural gas wellhead production. In the Texas Panhandle, the northernmost part of the state, which will experience the earliest and most extreme cold in the current event, temperatures are forecast to drop below 10 degrees Fahrenheit within the first 18 to 24 hours of the event's onset. The Railroad Commission's compliance data shows that wellheads in the Panhandle region have among the higher weatherization compliance rates of any Texas producing area, in part because the Panhandle has a history of cold weather and some existing cold weather operational practice. But higher compliance rate in a system where overall compliance is incomplete and field verification is 41% means the Panhandle wellhead fleet is better prepared than the Gulf Coast fleet, not that it is fully prepared. ERCOT's Grid Operations Center monitors wellhead production indirectly through natural gas pipeline pressure and flow data from the major transmission pipelines supplying gas to power plants. The first signal of wellhead freeze problems will be declining pipeline pressure at key measurement points along the Kinder Morgan and Enterprise Products gas transmission systems. ERCOT publishes real-time grid condition data through its public website, including total generation online by fuel type, updated every 5 minutes. The signal to watch is the natural gas generation capacity online number. In normal operating conditions, natural gas generation in Texas operates between 20 and 40,000 megawatts, depending on demand. Any sustained decline in the online natural gas capacity number beyond what is explained by reduced demand signals a supply problem. If natural gas supply begins declining in the first 48 hours of the event, ERCOT will activate its winter weather emergency protocols, public conservation appeals, emergency interruptible load service callouts, and coordination with the Railroad Commission to prioritize gas supply to electric generators, a critical customer designation process that Senate Bill 3 established specifically to ensure that power plant gas supply receives priority over industrial and some commercial uses during grid emergencies. The second critical variable is wind generation. Texas has approximately 42,000 megawatts of installed wind generating capacity, by far the largest wind fleet of any state. Wind generation in winter in Texas is contrary to the dominant 2021 narrative, a reliability asset rather than a liability in most cold weather events. The winter months are among the windiest in Texas, and wind turbines operate effectively in cold temperatures, including temperatures well below zero, when they are equipped with cold weather packages that include blade anti-icing systems, heated nacelles and control cabinets, and cold temperature rated lubricants. The wind turbines that failed in 2021 were not equipped with cold weather packages. The question for the current event is how many of the state's wind turbines have been winterized. The Wind Industries Trade Association, the American Clean Power Association, reported in its 2023 Texas Wind Winterization Survey that approximately 73% of Texas's wind capacity had been upgraded with at least partial cold weather modifications since 2021. Approximately 27% remained without full cold weather package upgrades. At the temperatures forecast for the current event in the Texas Panhandle, where the majority of the state's wind capacity is located, wind turbines without cold weather packages face the same blade icing and lubricant failure risks that grounded approximately 1,000 megawatts of wind capacity in 2021.
The third critical variable is demand, specifically peak demand relative to available generation. ERCOT's winter peak demand forecast for the current event, issued in ERCOT's public operational notice on the event date, projects peak demand in the range of 63 to 68,000 megawatts, depending on temperature verification. Against an available generation fleet that, under current winterization compliance levels, could lose 7,000 to 12,000 megawatts of capacity if gas supply problems develop at the scale of 2021, the margin between supply and demand is the number that determines whether ERCOT calls for conservation, calls for controlled load shedding, or faces the uncontrolled scenario. That margin, in the current setup, is narrower than ERCOT's public communications have
The intellectual
consistently
honesty
conveyed.
that this investigation has maintained throughout demands the systematic presentation of the three interpretations that the accumulated evidence supports, without resolving the genuine uncertainty in the direction that is most alarming or most reassuring. The first interpretation is the one that ERCOT's official public communications, Texas State Emergency Management, and the utilities across the southern states have been presenting as their operational working position. In this reading, the regulatory improvements implemented since 2021, Senate Bill 3's weatherization mandates, the inspection programs, the operating reserve demand curve market reform, the NWS ERCOT coordination protocols, have materially reduced the grid's vulnerability to the specific failure modes that produced the 2021 catastrophe. The natural gas generating units that are most critical to winter reliability have been inspected and are substantially compliant with minimum weatherization standards. The wind fleet has been significantly upgraded, the emergency management protocols are better coordinated, and ERCOT enters the current event with higher reserve margins than it had in 2021, a consequence of new generation capacity additions, including significant battery storage and additional wind and solar, that have increased the total generating fleet available to ERCOT by more than 15,000 megawatts since 2021. 15,000 megawatts of additional capacity. That is a real and significant buffer that did not exist in 2021, and it would need to be consumed entirely by freeze-related failures on top of the baseline losses, before ERCOT would approach the supply-demand crisis of 4 years ago. The second interpretation acknowledges what the first one holds in careful tension, that the compliance gaps documented in the Railroad Commission and Public Utility Commission data, 22% of critical natural gas facility submissions with deficiencies, 11% of electric generating unit inspections with high severity findings, 41% field verification overall, are not marginal statistical noise. They are concentrated in the specific infrastructure elements, wellheads, gathering systems, gas-fired generation, that the 2021 event identified as the primary failure pathway. And they are measured against weatherization standards whose calibration basis, historical temperature records, may not fully reflect the depth and persistence of the temperatures the current polar vortex displacement is capable of producing. If the current event produces temperatures and durations comparable to February 2021, which the forecast guidance at its median does, the compliance gaps in the natural gas supply chain represent a realistic risk of significant, though probably not 2021 scale, generation loss. The additional 15,000 megawatts of installed capacity provides buffer that 2021 did not have. Whether that buffer is sufficient to keep ERCOT in controlled rather than uncontrolled load-shedding territory depends on how much of the compliant and non-compliant natural gas fleet actually holds up when temperatures in the Permian Basin fall to 0 and below. The third interpretation confronts the specific tail risk that the evidence most clearly establishes and that neither of the first two interpretations fully addresses. It notes that the polar vortex displacement producing the current event is a 95th percentile SSW event at the extreme end of the historical distribution. It notes that the temperature depths being forecast in the Panhandle and Hill Country approach or exceed the February 2021 benchmark at specific locations. It notes that the weatherization standard calibration, built on historical records that excluded the 2021 event, may be systematically underspecified for the event that is now arriving. And it notes that the natural gas supply chain regulatory gap, the difference between what the electric generating unit framework requires and what the wellhead and gathering system framework requires, means that the most vulnerable part of the system is the least well-regulated part of the system. In this reading, the current event presents the realistic possibility, not the certainty, but the realistic possibility, supported by the documented compliance data and the forecast meteorology, of a supply-demand crisis in ERCOT that requires sustained, significant load shedding for periods longer than rotating outages can comfortably manage. Not a complete months-long blackout, not a 2021 exact recurrence, but an event in which hundreds of thousands to low millions of Texas households experience multi-day outages, in which the communities most vulnerable to cold exposure, the elderly, the medically dependent, the energy poor, experience the specific compound of extended outage plus cold that produced the 2021 mortality pattern, and in which the lessons of 2021 are relearned in real time at a cost that was not necessary. The additional buffer that 15,000 megawatts of new capacity provides is real. Whether it is large enough to prevent the second scenario from approaching the third depends on variables. The specific temperature verification relative to forecast, the specific failure rate of the non-compliant infrastructure under actual conditions, the specific coordination between ERCOT and the Railroad Commission in managing gas supply priority, that cannot be resolved before the event reaches its peak intensity. That irreducible uncertainty in a system whose worst-case failure mode was documented 4 years ago and whose consequences were measured in approximately 700 lives and $100 billion in damages is itself the central finding of this investigation. There are things we know, there are things we are watching, and there is a reckoning that this investigation has been building toward since Part 1. What we know, a 95th percentile sudden stratospheric warming event has disrupted the polar vortex, sending a lobe of Arctic air into the southern United States that is forecast to produce temperatures approaching or exceeding February 2021 levels at multiple Texas locations, sustained for 5 to 7 days. The ERCOT grid enters this event with an improved but incompletely weatherized natural gas supply chain, with 26% of wellhead facilities uncertified, 41% field verified, and weatherization standards calibrated to a historical temperature record that excludes the event they were designed to prevent the recurrence of. Electric generating unit inspection compliance is approximately 89%, with 11% showing high severity cold weather deficiencies. The wind fleet is approximately 73% upgraded. ERCOT has 15,000 additional megawatts of total installed capacity relative to 2021, providing a buffer that did not exist before. The natural gas supply chain codependency loop, in which gas infrastructure needs grid power and grid needs gas, remains the system's fundamental structural vulnerability. The housing stock, the energy poverty geography, and the demographics of the most vulnerable populations in the southern United States are unchanged from 2021. And the warning system has improved in NWS ERCOT operational coordination, but has not fully bridged the gap between weather warning and infrastructure impact communication for the general public. What we are watching, ERCOT's 5-minute generation mix data, specifically the natural gas capacity online number, which will be the leading indicator of any developing supply problem. The Railroad Commission's pipeline pressure monitoring data at the Waha Hub in the Permian Basin and the Katy Hub near Houston. The primary nodes at which gas supply pressure in the transmission system is observable, which will show, before power plant trips become visible, whether wellhead production is declining. ERCOT's emergency notices, issued through its public communications channel, which are the official signals of conservation appeals, emergency protocols, and load shedding orders. The NWS Winter Storm Warning updates for the Texas Panhandle, Hill Country, and the Gulf Coast, whose temperature verifications will determine how close the actual event tracks the worst-case forecast. And the rolling blackout advisories, if they are issued, from the transmission and distribution utilities. Oncor, CenterPoint Energy, AEP Texas, and Texas New Mexico Power, each of which serves a portion of the Texas distribution network, and each of which will be the ground-level operational actor if ERCOT calls for controlled load shedding. What we are owed, as a matter of governance and accountability in a state that experienced one of the most consequential infrastructure failures in American history 4 years ago, is a clear-eyed answer to a question that the post-event investigations asked, that the Senate Bill 3 rulemaking process asked, and that the subsequent compliance data has only partially answered. Is the system that is about to be tested by this polar vortex event actually fixed? The honest answer, based on the evidence available in the public record, is partially. Meaningfully partially, not fully. The gap that remains, concentrated in the natural gas supply chain, in the housing stock, in the regulatory architecture that left wellheads and gathering systems under a less stringent framework than the one that governs the generating units they fuel, is not a gap that has been hidden. It has been documented by the FERC-NERC investigation, by the Texas A&M academic postmortems, by the University of Texas Energy Institute, by the legislative testimony of researchers who spent years studying exactly this system and reported exactly this finding to exactly the right audience. The gap is known. The gap is documented. The gap is present in this event. What happens inside that gap? Whether the non-compliant infrastructure holds under actual temperatures that approach its design limits, whether the buffer of new capacity is sufficient to absorb the failures that occur, whether the emergency protocols produce controlled outcomes faster than the 2021 experience, is being determined right now in real time in compressor stations in the Permian Basin and in natural gas plants in the Hill Country and in the ERCOT Operations Center in Taylor, Texas. We will be tracking every data point available in the public domain throughout this event. ERCOT's generation mix data, the NWS temperature verifications, the Railroad Commission pipeline pressure bulletins, the emergency notices. If load shedding is ordered, we will track the utility bulletins. If the system approaches the frequency thresholds that 2021 approached,
because the people in the path of this event, in the poorly insulated houses, with the electric heat and the uninsulated pipes and the oxygen concentrators, deserve to know not just that it is going to be very cold, but what very cold means for the specific infrastructure that their survival depends on. And the rest of the country deserves to understand that this is not a Texas-specific problem. It is an American infrastructure problem, a problem of how a society prices reliability, how it regulates critical infrastructure, how it translates known risk into institutional action, and whether the reckoning that a catastrophe demands is allowed to be complete or allowed to stop short of what the physics requires. February 2021 was a test. The current polar vortex displacement is a retest. The scores are being taken right now. We will be here for every number. We will tell you what each one means. The investigation continues.